So I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening to celebrate our friend and colleague Jake Gersen as he becomes the Sidley Austin Professor of Law. So I want to take a moment first to extend a warm welcome to members of Jake's family who are here tonight. So his mother Karen is here. Mother Karen. His aunts Michelle and Meg. All right, there we go. His uncle Michael. And his daughters Natalie and Nina. So let's give Natalie and Nina a big round of applause, okay? Now, before I talk about Professor Gersen, I'd just like to say a few words about the Sidley Austin Professorship. So nearly 15 years ago, and during the law school setting the standard campaign, Sidley Austin and its attorneys established the Sidley Austin Professor of Law. And it's a great honor to have Sidley's name associated with Harvard Law School. We remain very grateful that our friends at the firm enabled us to have a Sidley Austin chair for somebody very talented like Jake Gersen and the other people who have held the chair. This is a great way to support a talented and an accomplished professor, and it enriches our intellectual community. It's a meaningful part of the continued excellence of the Harvard Law School, and it will be for many generations to come. I also want to say a special thanks to Chuck Douglas, class of 1974, who is joining us tonight with his wife, Diane. So let's give a big round to Chuck and Diane. Chuck's a partner and a senior trial attorney at Sidley Austin, and he served as the chair of the firm's management committee from 1999 to 2014. That is a long time to chair a law firm. Chuck exemplifies his devotion to his firm, to his clients, to his community, and to his alma mater, and we're very grateful. Chuck, thank you for pledging your personal support for the professorship, as well as the work that you did in rallying the support from your firm and from your fellow HLS alumni practicing at the firm. Thanks to your tireless efforts, this important faculty chair stands in perpetuity to help educate the world's best lawyers, public servants, business leaders, public interest leaders, legal scholars year after year after year. So please join me in a round of applause to thank Chuck Douglas for his leadership in this. Now, I'm going to turn to Jake Gersen. So I've known Jake for about, 15 years now, long time. He's a dedicated legal scholar. He's a great political scientist. What Jake brings to his work is he brings a real-world sensibility to the problems of governance. And I'll say that he brings the same thing to his role on our faculty. Jake is a great teacher. He's a great institutional contributor. He is always direct and blunt, but in a very nice way, in a very generous way, and in a very giving way. And I've worked with him very closely, and he's a wonderful person to work with. He's also a generous member of our faculty. When we need something, when we need him to step up and teach something, he does so. And he'll sometimes teach two things the same year that we need, if we need it. And he's a great teacher and a great colleague and a great scholar. He's very versatile. His subjects include administrative law, election law, education, sex discrimination. In total, he is the author or co-author of more than 30 scholarly works, and his scholarship has been profiled in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, in Forbes, and in Time. In 2013, Jake founded the Food Law Lab, which supports academic research on the legal treatment of food in society. And he's the co-editor of Food Law and Policy, and he's currently working on a book called From Court to Table, which is about the relationship between food and law. I once heard Jake describe the importance of the rapidly growing field of food law in the following way. Here it is, and this is Jake being very direct. The law can make it easier or harder to eat better food. In my view, the law is a map. Food law is a map. It is a way to identify pitfalls, avoid them, and move toward a better destination. The question is, where are we going and how quickly can we get there? And tonight we're going to hear some thoughts about that as we hear Jake give his chair lecture, Wholesome, Food, Law, Life. Without further delay, Jake Gersen.
Thank you, John, for that introduction. Thank you to the donors for their support of the law school and the chair, to my family and friends and students who are here today. I really appreciate it. My talk today is titled Wholesome, Food, Law, and Life. And it's a point of, modest professional pride that in 15 years of doing this, I have never once started a talk by citing the dictionary. I don't know, it just always seemed like a gimmick, like a trick or a device to attract attention. But over time, I've recognized that even in professional careers, mere competence and craftsmanship is no substitute for a gimmick. Words to live by, kids. And now that I've broken that 15-year streak, I'm all in. Wholesome. Oxford English Dictionary. Conducive to or promoting mental or moral well-being, intended or tending to do good, beneficial. Having the property of restoring physical health, remedial, curative, medicinal. Skip that. Especially of a person in good condition, free from disease, corruption, virtuous. Nautical, of a ship or boat, stable in the water. It is this last definition that I want to spend most of my time on today. Poor Dean. Over the years, I've come to recognize that almost all of our scholarship is autobiographical in one way or another, and the trick is to figure out how. So here are some plain facts to start. At the end of the 1960s, my parents were living in Manhattan. My dad was driving a cab. By all accounts, he wasn't great at it. Either because he was too scared to pick up fares, or because the fares were too scared to get in the cab. My parents picked up, left the city, moved to Maine, and quite literally went back to the land. My father kept bees for honey. My mother had a giant loom for weaving. They had a mill to grind their own flour. Honestly, I don't know how they paid their bills. I was told, a macrobiotic baby. Cute, right? I got less cute over time. A visual theme is starting to emerge. That's legendary rock guitarist Frank Zappa, who appears in every talk I give for reasons I don't fully understand. That moment in the late 60s was about many things, of course. But it was in part, I think, about a longing for a way of being that was, fill in the blank. Simpler, safer, connected, more natural, and yes, because I don't hide the ball in talks, more wholesome. It was a kind of nostalgia for a different way of being and a different way of eating, for a time or return to a place it never had actually been. In 1966, federal agents from the Food and Drug Administration raided a small natural food store in Boston, Erewhon. And maybe raided is a little strong. They might have just knocked with a warrant. But regardless, in the basement, they found an elderly Japanese man who spoke very little English, tending a shop. The agents demanded he turn over all of the contraband he had, everything illegal. That is to say, all of his copies of a book called Zen Macrobiotics by George Ochoa. The book, still in print today, advocates avoiding sugar, canned foods, fruits, vegetables produced with pesticides, avoiding most meats, and urges a lot of miso, a surprising amount of miso, soy, and the like. And a lot of the foods, maybe all the foods, stocked by Erewhon were advocated by the book. They were adherents. When the FDA agents were denied initially, they went back to their car to get, flashlights, so they could search the building comprehensively. The old man's daughter gathered up all the copies of macrobiotics and dumped them in the dumpster out back. Eventually, the FDA agents left, dejected and defeated, though they'd had a successful raid in New York the prior week. Now, why exactly were federal agents raiding a small natural food store to seize copies of a diet book. Well, Sidley claimed that his diet could cure all sorts of illnesses and disease. Appendicitis, bedwetting, cancer, glaucoma, gonorrhea, headache, heart disease, hemophilia. It's an alphabetical list. It's a long list. And that, said the FDA, was unlawful. You can't sell food and talk about it in a way that says it's curing disease or preventing disease. Now, full disclosure, we still sell Zen macrobiotics at the family bookstore in Portland, Maine, started by my father and run by my brother. And if you look carefully, you can see it on the shelf. Gimmick. Zen macrobiotics was one of 2 books around the house, 2 food books growing up. The other one was this one, the Tassajara bread book, Macrobiotics and Bread. Today, Sylvester Graham is best known for the cracker that bears his name. Tell me some more. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I hate myself, I'm really sorry. But Graham had an entire sect of followers. He traveled around lecturing on diet, alcohol, sex, gender relations, you name it. And legend has it, though I think this part can't be right, that the term mobbed was coined to describe what happened when his audience grew so unruly that they chased him out of a town. He was chased out of Portland and Boston and New York. He was chased out of everywhere. But he got his start not with crackers, but with flour and bread. For Graham, bread was a kind of magic treatment. He lived in Boston and in 1837 wrote a treatise on bread, in which he said, "Sadly today, most people depend on public bakers for their bread." This public bread was bad for 2 reasons. First, it was made with Western flour. Ooh. Graham thought this far-off Western flour was cheaper and lower quality. It was produced by nameless, faceless strangers who he was convinced were over-extracting the soil, over-planting, over-fertilizing to squeeze every bit of extra wheat out of a given season. And anticipating an organic farming movement, an idea that came a century later, he insisted that produces less nutritious, less healthy wheat, and therefore less healthy flour, and therefore less healthy bread. Second, these public bakers were adulterating their bread. They were using chemical agents and additives, alum, sulfate of zinc, subcarbonate of magnesia, sulfate of copper. And then they try to hide all these additives and preservatives with chalk and clay and plaster of Paris to make the bread look the same, to make it the right color and the right weight. Public bread looked identical, Graham thought, but it was inferior at best and poisonous at worst. In fact, the 1800s are full of reports like this, both in Europe and here. Dangerous ways that food sellers were tinkering with food to increase profits. Disease and death in the pot and in the bottle. So Graham saw a kind of danger in the marketplace and a safety in return home. Eat private bread baked at home. Now, Graham was, of course, expressing an anxiety that's a familiar one for us. What industrialization is doing to society, what it meant for morals and crime and identity and religion and yada, yada, yada. But this anxiety for Graham manifested as an obsession with disease. He and others were casting about for a unifying theory of disease. Germ theory, the idea that microbes and viruses, bacteria from the outside world cause disease, would eventually win the day, though there's some recent research that suggests maybe not. But in the 1800s, it hadn't really won yet. So very, very influential theories were really updated versions of the old humoral theories. So Hippocrates, recall, said the body is made up of 4 fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Yum. Perfect health is achieved when those 4 are all in balance. They're in appropriate proportion to each other. Pain is felt when there's an excess or defect in one of them. Eventually, Galen and others built up a much more elaborate system. The 4 humors get associated with the 4 seasons, the 4 stages of life, the 4 tastes, and 4 pretty much whatever you can imagine. Blood, hot and wet, spring, infancy, sweet. Yellow bile, hot and dry, summer, youth, bitter. Black bile, cold and dry, autumn, maturity, sour. Maturity sounds so much better than middle age. Phlegm, cold and wet, winter, old age, salty. And the idea is that a bad diet gives rise to disease because it breaks the balance of humors in the body. Eat too much dry food, it turns normal bile into black bile. An excess of black bile causes melancholia. So the key to health is keeping the whole system in balance, in proportion, not too much of any one element, just moderation. I know, me too. Skipping forward 1,000 years or so, and that's how you can tell I'm not a historian. France, 1800s. Broussais and others are arguing suddenly that gastrointestinal irritation is the effective source of all disease. Cancer, syphilis, tuberculosis, all of it. They're drawing on work by Cullen, Scottish physician, who claimed that any big increase in nervous energy or deficit produced illness or health. Another idea was that the stomach is essentially the key point of contact between the 2 internal systems, the organic system and the nervous system. So when the stomach is out of sorts, it spreads to the entire body. You've got to keep the stomach okay. The stomach is out of sorts, that's what produces diseases. Now, there are a lot of variants here and a lot of nuances here. I'm happy to talk more about it, but the key organizing principle is the thing to be avoided is irritation, inflammation, or excitement. This helps us explain a kind of modest puzzle in food history. These guys, kind of the founding fathers of the modern food industry, at least the cereal industry, were almost without fail zealots of the bland. Graham flour and graham bread we know. Henry Perky developed shredded wheat. Developed it here in Cambridge after being prescribed a diet of bland wheat mush. It cured his ailments, but he found it was edible only after you baked it into a crisp biscuit. He patented the shredded wheat biscuit making machine, and the rest is history. C.W. Post modeled his grape nuts after a miracle food cure he found while he was trying to cure a long list of his own ailments, though it was alleged he stole the idea. He distributed his Road to Wellville along every single box that he sold. The first Kellogg cereal products were developed at Battle Creek, where ailing patients moved into the sanatorium for extended period of stays, and a diet of vegetarianism and intentionally bland food. Granola, granula, all the same. All of these recipes were nearly tasteless. They stimulated the senses not at all, and that was by design. It was by design because they all shared a theory of disease, though they didn't always get along. Stimulation is what causes disease. Spicy food inflames the digestive tract. Coffee produces nervous energy. Sugar produces excitement. That's why Post's first product wasn't cereal. It was a coffee substitute called Wholesome, still available today. Caffeine stimulates the body. Coffee steals your heart. Oh, it's Valentine's Day. Post's famous tagline, "There's a reason," is actually a key moment in the development of advertising history and marketing theory. I'm sorry, that's a different lecture. Ask me about it later. But because being wholesome meant being healthy and because disease was caused by excitement, they weren't just focused on food. They were focused on all parts of life that could cause excitement, particularly sex, of course. Almost to a person, they were anti-sex advocates. So Kellogg's Plain Facts about sexuality, or sexual life, is a comprehensive guide to sex throughout every life stage. He was deeply religious. He was part of the Seventh-day Adventists before he got kicked out. But the book is not about the sanctity of marriage. What he called marital excess was every bit as much a threat to health as premarital sex or masturbation. Indeed, though views varied, Kellogg, Graham, and others insisted that thinking about sex was just as bad as actually having sex. Why? Because the mere thought excites the body. It irritates organs, it inflames tissues, all of which disrupts the internal balance of the system. Sex here is unwholesome not because God is lurking, but because cholera is coming. Now, food and sex, excitement, and disease, they all run together. Says Kellogg, various disease, which cause local irritation and congestion of the reproductive organs, are the causes of unchastity. Causes of unchastity, which causes more irritation and excitement, which causes more disease. Good tasting food stimulates appetite for other sorts of stimulating activity, moral depravity, and ultimately illness. Wholesome people eat wholesome food, which makes them healthy, which is to say wholesome. Depraved people are diseased people, and diseased people are depraved. No sugar, no spice. Now note that as I've talked, and you can see this in the writing of these folks as well, there's a little bit of a slip. So we start by achieving balance and proportion by moderation, that is to say, by temperance. Not too much of any one thing. But by the end of it, we're achieving balance by isolation, by preserving purity. Drink no alcohol, have no sex, eat as little food as possible, make sure it has no spice at all. Isolate the body from all external stimuli. That's the key to health. Terminology varies a little bit, but the idea is the outside world, the inorganic world, the animal world, is a constant threat to the internal world, the vegetative world, the organic world. Isn't this supposed to be a talk about law? We're getting there. There's an intermission after part 6. The term wholesome used to be a standard part of our vocabulary or vernacular for speaking about good and legitimate law. Our old colonial charters, many of them, have language like authorizing leaders to make fit and wholesome laws. Make fit and wholesome laws. Some say the term fit and wholesome was part of the backdrop for necessary and proper in the Constitution. Necessary and proper, fit and wholesome. The old cases are filled with descriptions like wholesome maxims of the common law, a sound and wholesome rule. Fit and wholesome. Fit and wholesome. Now, if there's a founding father of modern federal food law, it's probably Harvey Wiley. He was born and raised in Indiana, fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, got his medical degree, and eventually took a job in the Bureau of Chemistry in the Department of Agriculture, 1892. In 1902, Congress appropriated money for him to evaluate the effect of food additives on human health. There was a sense that the food supply is horribly contaminated, and they wanted to know, are all these additives and preservatives safe? It was a different time. So if you wanted to know the effect of a given food additive on human health, you just fed it to a bunch of humans. Wiley recruited volunteers from the Department of Agriculture. They moved in to monitor quarters, spent several months in regulated constant surveillance, ate only what they were fed, which was honestly not great, and then submitted to evaluations. The experiments purported to show all sorts of negative health effects of additives and preservatives common in the food supply. The 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act, this is when the federal government really starts going with this stuff, was passed after a series of public food scandals, the Wiley poison squad experiments, and advocacy of a variety of pure food groups in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And that framework is still pretty much the law today. It's been amended, but that's the basic structure. Food is illegal if it's adulterated, and food is illegal if it's misbranded. A food shall be deemed adulterated. No, we're not going to do that. If it contains a substance which may render it injurious to human health, or has an added substance that's unsafe. And it's deemed misbranded if, well, there are a lot of circumstances, but the basic idea is, this food, what is it? If the ordinary reasonable consumer can't tell, it's probably misbranded. If you're selling butter without milk or ice cream without dairy, it's probably misbranded, if they're confused. Now, Wiley's work with the Poison Squad was about adulteration, taking a thing that's pure and rendering it unsafe. A big target of his was an additive called benzoate of soda. It seems commonly used in ketchup, at least vintage ketchup. Benzoate of soda is derived from benzoic acid, which is a naturally occurring substance in some other foods like cranberries. He was once giving testimony on the Hill, basically getting interrogated, and was asked a gotcha question. Do you think cranberries are unwholesome because they contain benzoic acid? The crowd gasped, I assume. He replied, I think cranberries would be more wholesome if the Almighty left out the benzoic acid. Now, this was a snarky response, but it marks a critical turning point in the understanding of what it means to be wholesome. In prior years, the idea was food that is natural or untampered with is the gold standard. The challenge is to find it in the marketplace. Wholesome food was natural food. For Wiley, natural food wasn't as good as it gets at all. Wholesome meant methodologically something much closer to what the food industry that he so despised thought. Two competing visions now. One is a kind of purity vision. That which is pure is wholesome. Before touched by man, innocent, moral, uncorrupted, adulterated. It's kind of before the fall vision. The other is perfection. Take the natural as an unwholesome starting place, often a dangerous one, and render it improved by removing impurities, defects, and enhancing positive attributes. Familiar dichotomy, maybe. Wiley's Bureau of Chemistry administered and enforced the Pure Food and Drug Act, but the agency was located in the Department of Agriculture. James Tama Jim Wilson was the longest serving, most influential, and probably most powerful Secretary of Agriculture in history. He served under 3 presidents and oversaw a complete transformation of the American food supply. Wiley and Wilson were not quite friends, maybe frenemies, no enemies. They argued about everything, often in front of the president. And after Wiley tried to tell President Roosevelt that saccharin was dangerous in his coffee, Wilson usually won out. Now, Wilson saw 2 changes, many changes. I want to talk about 2 in the food supply. The first actually wasn't about food per se. It was about roads. The dirt and gravel road system was transformed by the Office of Public Roads, which was a division in the Department of Agriculture. And that meant foods could more easily get from one coast to the other, particularly in combination with the rails. All of which made Graham's terror about flour from far-off lands a pervasive feature of the food supply. Second, the science of genetics, heredity, and crossbreeding in agriculture was progressing at an almost breakneck speed. New foods were everywhere. Luther Burbank was born here in Massachusetts, 1849. He was raised on a farm and said to have been profoundly influenced by Darwin and later Mendel, the principles of heredity. He developed more than 800 new strains of plant, including 113 varieties of plums. He created the white blackberry, and the wonderberry, which for reasons that elude me, spurred massive social outcry and an anti-wonderberry movement. Burbank and the other breeders worked very closely with Wilson and the Department of Agriculture. Wilson advanced the proper place of the breeders' work in agricultural policy. The core idea was natural food is just a starting place. Fruits, vegetables, grains are full of defects. They're waiting for science and man to perfect. American Breeders Magazine was published from 1910 to 1913. It contained a kind of melange of opinion, argument, and studies on topics all related to breeding. Breeding animals, breeding plants, and yes, breeding people. Within a handful of years, the magazine and the association had changed names and its emphasis, becoming the American Genetic Association and the Journal of Heredity. The pages are populated with the same work on sexuality in plants, walnuts, material for plant breeders, but also feeble-mindedness and superiority of the eldest. Now, this is not a talk about eugenics per se, but at this moment, maybe always, what it meant for food to be wholesome was blended with what it meant for humans to be wholesome. It became a project of perfecting. Indeed, many of the temperance and pure food activist organizations that helped pass the statute had standing committees on heredity. Discussions of the Wonderberry and eugenics were often one and the same. That quest for the best took place on state fair agricultural circuits all across the country. Competitions for better berries, happier hogs, or plumper pumpkins soon gave rise to contests for better babies. Mary Watts and Florence Brown Sherburne organized Better Babies in Iowa. And after receiving new evaluation forms from Charles Davenport, they organized the first Fitter Families contest at the Kansas State Fair in 1920. Health and wholesome are taking on a different meaning. And by 1935, we see advertisements like this one, expressly linking eugenics and the quality of the food supply. Here, Del Monte corn. Here's a poem. You talk of your breed of cattle and plan for the higher strain. You double the food of the pasture and heap up the measure of grain. You draw on the wits of the nation to bother the barn and the pen. But what are you doing, my brothers, to better the breed of men? Okay. Food improvement, self-improvement, social improvement. Stop individual disease, stop social disease. This project of perfection is what Wholesome became. This is a Fitter Families evaluation form from Battle Creek, Michigan. Battle Creek is sometimes called Food Town. It's where Kellogg and Post and all the others lived and worked. It kind of was to the food and health industry what Silicon Valley is to tech. The Battle Creek Sanatorium was started in 1866 by Kellogg. The SAN, as it was nicknamed, was the most successful health clinic in the country and maybe the world. He preached that same steady diet of bland, unexciting food, vegetarianism, and a lack of sexual stimulation. It's been the subject of many, many excellent books and one not so excellent movie. As the health and food industry started to take off, hopefuls from all over the country descended on Battle Creek. At what point there were more than 100 cereal companies. It was part Wild West, part Mad Men, part Music Man. Trouble with a capital T and that rhymes with C and that stands for cereal. Sorry, the kids did Music Man at school recently. Now, if you can imagine walking down the street of Battle Creek at this time, all manners of foods being hawked. This one will cure what ails you. This one will make you healthy. This one will make you live longer. This one will. This is the Battle Creek problem. Thousands of foods, thousands of claims, all about health, and no way to know which one is true and which one is false. Copycats and imitators everywhere. Can't tell which is the real thing. Remember Zen macrobiotics? Feels like a long time ago, doesn't it? The modern rule is you can't make a health claim about a food. Can't make a claim about a food's effect on disease, prevention, or mitigation, or cure, unless it's substantiated. Certain kinds of evidence. You need government approval. This is the Zen macrobiotics problem. Too little talk, not allowed to say too much, can't tell which foods are actually healthy. If you ask people what they care about when choosing food, when deciding what to eat, and we've asked a lot, they always say the same thing. Health, taste, and price. Price you observe right away with certainty. Taste you know after the first bite. Health you just don't ever really learn. You don't ever really see. So we're in a kind of chronic state of not quite knowing. This is one reason there's still so much litigation over the use of the term wholesome or natural in food. Can a food be wholesome if it contains petroleum products, is made with GMOs, is high in sugar, contains sodium benzoate? Sound familiar? It's not so much that we are what we eat, but that knowing what we eat tells us about who we are. And not knowing produces that same old Gramian anxiety. Am I wholesome? Am I wholesome? Wholesome, nautical, of a ship or a boat, stable in the water, not liable to roll. When a boat is wholesome, it means it is steady. Another word for that situation, when a boat is steady, proceeding in a smooth and level manner, under control, balanced, is even keel. That's my old parents' boat, the even keel. That's my dad, who passed away a few years ago. I miss you, Dad. Thanks for listening, everyone. I've been directed to take some questions, is that correct? Yeah.
Please.
Which only presents the embarrassing situation of not having any questions. My old friend and colleague, Tom Ginsberg, yeah.
I do recall teaching a wine law at one time. And you may remember in that exploration, we learned that in wine, you don't have to label anything. You can put almost anything in wine except sulfides without saying. So I guess my question for you is about variation. Why do we observe variation across foods, or do we? And why across these categories, food and wine? What's the driving force for observed regulatory difference?
Yeah, so I think what we observe, and I'm not committed to this view, but I think what we observe is kind of chaos. So there's a section of a project I'm doing called The Regulatory Jungle. And there's this, Upton Sinclair wrote this famous book, The Jungle, about absolute sort of chaos in the food supply and horrible practices. And I think we've left that world, but we have a kind of equivalent regulatory jungle. So if you sit down to try to read what the rules are about a given food product, even within, with wine or food, it is madness. It's pages and pages and pages of impossible to read text, and with different sort of regulatory emphasis, but it's madness. And the stance that we've taken by and large is a kind of wait and see. So I work with some companies who desperately want to know, is this new thing that I'm making water or juice? It doesn't quite meet the definition of water. It doesn't quite meet the definition of juice. We don't care. We just want to do what's proper. We want to build our plant in a way that comports with the respective regulations. Almost all the time the FDA says, we're not saying. Bring it to market and we'll see. That's not a wonderful state of affairs. I think what we've seen continuous with this early time period and now is just the proliferation of new products. Different kinds of milk or non-milk, different kinds of meat or non-meat. And all of the fights we're having, or so many of them, about what we call it. Can you call it meat if it's not made from an animal? What if it's come from a lab? What if, on and on and on and on. And I think we have sort of instincts or impulses, but we don't have answers to those questions yet. So if you think about milk, almond milk, soy milk, is it milk? Well, one side says, well, you use it like milk. It's functional in the way that milk is, so that's what we should call it. The other side says it doesn't come from a cow. It just comes from water and nuts. There's no answer to these questions. These are metaphysical. And the question is what's the food regime going to settle on and do? And I wish I could say that we've done it, but we have a regulatory jungle. Tom?
If there's no answer, should law butt out?
I have conflicting impulses. What you see is that there's two problems I mentioned at the end or throughout the talk. The Battle Creek problem, which is just constant chatter, and the silence problem, the Zen macrobiotics problem, both those are failures. But the truth is that we don't have any particularly good mechanism in between of ensuring that the claims that we get are the right claims. And part of that problem, I think, is just a function of choice. So if you go to the supermarket and look at the shelf, like the overarching feature of like modern industrial food is like choice. There are 62 kinds of olive oil. I don't know which one is best. I don't know which one is healthy. And I don't even really know how to ask that question. So there are, I think, failures in the market, which is not today's talk, but we can talk more about why I think really good healthy food is being undersupplied and why it's so hard to get, even though people really, really want it. But that's, I think, where we should be working. Law can help with that, but it can't do everything. Time for one more question? I don't know what we've got. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. A lot of your talk had to do with how the food law and food regime was built around its impact on people's well-being. I was just wondering, because recently there's been a lot more studies about the externalities to the environment and to the surrounding area. I just wondering how you think that will impact the food regime and food law. So such as like meat production leading to increasing greenhouse gases.
Right, so you can sort of imagine two potential worlds. One is a world which is kind of centralized command and control to government decision making, where the government says, okay, here's what we want to do. We want to minimize the overall impact of supplying the population with food. You know, maybe it's per calorie, maybe it's per bite, I don't know what it is, but that's what we want to do. And we'll push our resources, either through subsidies or taxation, towards those sorts of foods. The other is like, well, this is a pretty consumer-driven market, and if people care about this, then we'll just be able to tell them. And then they'll buy those food products, and then the market over time will get into an equilibrium and adjust. The work that we've done so far on the second possibility seems pretty disappointing, or pessimistic, I would say. That is, people say they care about this, but they don't seem to when it comes time to purchase or choose what to eat. Those big three, health, taste, price, they just swamp everything out. Fair labor practices, international, environmental, they just swamp everything. What that means is like probably that ordinary market structure is not going to get it done. And that might mean, well, we're just out of luck. Or it might mean sort of more creative policies or government policies could push in that direction. Excuse me, one more thing to say. I think in general, a modest thing we could agree on is that more information is better. And there's a temptation to think anything that is new and not animal is better for the environment, and I'm not sure that's the case. Some of the artificial or new or plant-based meat products are much better, and some of them are not. But those, I think, are the figures we should be working on rather than just merely marketing. It's a modest thing. We're good? Questions? There you go. Yes, ma'am.
So building off of your last answer and this question about information in the food system, I'm wondering where a kind of story of power historically is in your definition of wholesome. Because some of the fights about almond milk or soy milk are also fights of the dairy industry that has a big control over policy making, kind of trying to keep their sphere in terms of what can be labeled what. And kind of thinking through recent big scandals, particularly around this question of information. Last summer, and I guess the kind of months of, or last spring, there was so much in the news about glyphosates with very different scientific bodies coming out in complete opposite directions on what exactly were the impacts of glyphosates in food. And there were accusations of Monsanto funding a bunch of the research that was positive glyphosate, and then the World Health Organization not actually looking into, not having good science behind their critiques of it. So I'm just curious how you see kind of questions of power and control in the food system shaping even our understandings of what wholesome is, and I guess the system more broadly.
Yeah, so my basic stance is, it's not a naive one, but it's basic, I think, which is to say I think that power and influence does a lot of work, not just here, but everywhere, essentially, and it's impossible to divorce our particular understandings from any of that. I think what strikes me about working in this historical time period, which I've been doing a little bit too long, is how little anything has changed. And I don't mean like, boy, the interest groups are fighting and the activist groups, I mean the exact terms of the exact debates haven't changed. 1900s, they're fighting about benzoate of soda. That's what we're fighting about today. They're fighting about saccharin. That's what we're fighting about 75 years later. Actually, the same additives and preservatives are fought about. And every 30 or 40 years or 50 years, we get a new piece of legislation. Aha, everyone's very concerned about this. We get a new statute. So in the 50s, 60s, you get statutes regulating additives and preservatives. But the basic operating principle of all of those statutes, or at least 90% of them, is that anything that is in use at the time can be used in the future. So all the stuff that gave rise to massive federal legislation, new regulatory structure, all those concerns, all those additives, all those preservatives, those are fine to keep in the food supply. Anything new you've got to show is safe. Now that grandfathering has something to say for it. You depress some resistance politically, so you can get the measure passed. But it's happened a lot. And so my sense is, and I can't show this, but I can speculate a little bit, is that if you look at the practice of food additives and preservatives in like 1908 and the practice today, it's remarkably similar. And that is a pessimistic story, unless you think that all those additives and preservatives are totally safe and fine, in which case you should celebrate. And your point is, gosh, after 100 years, I still feel like we don't really know. And I feel the same thing, and that is disheartening. That is disheartening. Almost done.
It seems in the contemporary world, I guess, and I'm sure think of this, that the perfection.
Louder, please.
Sorry, it seems in the modern world, the perfection side of that argument. Try three. It seems that in the modern world, the perfection side of the.
It's very good projection. Good job.
Thank you. Has won out in the sense that most of the food regime is about making sure that things are healthy or better or not going to make people sick. But it also seems that I think in recent years there has been sort of a return among some people to the desire for purity. So I think about the non-GMO movement or the recent trend of selling natural water that is very not good. So how would the regime nowadays that exists try to govern that and police it, in particular where a claim to purity doesn't always mean a claim that the thing is actually healthy, and so you could lead to large-scale health scares, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so I think I want to, I have a bunch to say, but I think mostly what I want to say is to resist the first part of the question, that the perfection has won out. So what you see over the arc of, 100, 200 years, something like that, is repetition. It's just repeated over and over the same cycle. And you see that a longing that I started with for something that is pure, for something that is natural, for something that is safe. And it just pops up every 20 to 40 years. And it pops up because we've been doing it differently. It's kind of selection effect. What we've been seeing is the perfection, the push for perfection. And then there's resistance to that. And then there's a movement. And sometimes it's successful and sometimes it's not. Mostly what we've seen today in the past 2 decades, 3 decades, is that same sentiment coupled with a really, really robust market. So that there's an abundance of those foods being produced out there, actually. Some really good foods. There's some really wholesome, really healthy, really pure foods. It's just really hard to figure out which they are. And that, I think, is the modern problem. We see both those wills, both those sorts of foods, and it's really a sorting mechanism that we so desperately need, in my view.